Here is every hunter in Supervive explained in under 1 minute. The game is still in early development. If you're watching this long after its upload, some things might have changed, but the basics should still be there. Let's begin. Bishop has a mix of long-range poke and hard engage. Her left click is a pretty long-range rocket that deals damage and has a small AoE. Her passive is that every time she lands a direct hit with her left click, the next left click will be stronger and her mobility spell's cooldown is reduced. Her right click places an explosive satchel that she can explode manually. It deals damage to enemies and knocks herself and enemies back. Her mobility spell has several charges and is sends her flying in the air. Enemies close to her takes damage and are knocked back. This ability slams enemies, meaning that if they are over the abyss, they get spiked even though they're not using their glider. Her E is a small charge-up punch that launches enemies away. If they hit a wall, they are stunned, take a bunch of extra damage, and they also deal AoE damage around them to other enemies. Her ultimate sends her flying off, covering a great distance. If she hits an enemy, she deals damage and stuns them based on the distance she travels. Enemies around the target also take damage and are knocked back. Brall is a melee DPS without any nipples. His passive is an orange bar that fills up when he deals damage. When it's maxed, he becomes empowered, granting him more damage, attack speed, and ability haste. Brall also heals on creep and hunter kills, and he can climb double high ground walls with his jump. Pressing left click chains together quick attacks, while holding it down fires out a ranged attack. His E is a chain that he can attach to enemies or terrain. He can then activate it again to pull himself towards them. His right click deals more damage if he hits it in the sweet spot. It also deals more damage if they're below half health. Getting a knock with this ability resets his ultimate. If he holds down the button, it turns into a dash attack that knocks enemies away. If he uses this while in the air, it turns into a stun and a slam. If he uses it while using his E, it turns into a spin attack that applies anti-heal to all enemies hit. His mobility is a dash that also attacks enemies. It has several charges that all reset on its cooldown. His ultimate makes him invulnerable for half a second. He then strikes back, dealing a bunch of damage and healing for a lot of the damage dealt. Knocking an enemy with this resets its cooldown. Felix is a ranged hunter that wants to set all enemies on fire. His left click is a medium-ranged flamethrower that deals damage over time and after a while applies his passive, Ignite. Ignite is a 5-second dot that burns enemies for their max HP every second. If reapplied for long enough, it grows into a level 2 Ignite that is more powerful. His right click shoots out a firebolt that deals damage, knocks enemies back, and applies Ignite. If the enemy was already ignited, it is instead upgraded to Ignite level 2. His mobility spell is a dash that has 2 charges. It deals damage, knocks enemies back, and applies Ignite. His E pulls nearby enemies towards him. It also deals damage, applies anti-heal, and gives Felix a shield. When he knocks an enemy hunter, this ability's cooldown is reset. His ultimate lets him fly a great distance with a bit of maneuverability. It leaves behind a trail of flames that lasts for 4 seconds. The flames slow enemies, deals damage, and quickly applies Ignite. Ghost is a dude with a gun. His left click fires rapidly and deals slightly more damage at the start of the magazine. His right click fires out a grenade that sticks to enemies. It then deals damage and dazes them. If stuck to terrain, the grenade gets stronger. It now explodes in a big cone, dazes them for longer, and knocks enemies back. If they're knocked into terrain, they're stunned. If the wall grenade hits an enemy, the cooldown is greatly reduced. His E fires a huge railgun that pierces most terrain and deals damage. Dazed enemies takes extra damage, and hitting a hunter reduces the cooldown of this ability. His mobility spell is a dash. If this dash is used on the ground and released early, the cooldown is greatly reduced. Ghost's passive resets the cooldown of his mobility spell every time he knocks an enemy. When the dash is fully leveled up, assists are enough to get the reset. His ultimate is an airstrike that deals more damage in the center of its explosion. It also leaves behind a zone that deals damage over time and slows enemies. Joule is all about dealing massive damage by getting resets on her mobility spell. Joule's mobility spell is a long-range dash that deals damage to every enemy it passes through. Joule's passive applies 1 stack of static whenever she deals damage to a target. When the target reaches the maximum of 4 stacks, dashing through the target deals extra damage, refunds a bunch of mana, and completely resets its cooldown. Joule's left click is a lightning bolt that deals damage and applies a stack. Joule's E can be aimed in different directions, and after a short delay, enemies hit by it are sent that way. It also applies a stack of static. Joule's right click deals damage based on how long it was charged up, and sends the enemies flying back. Targets colliding with a wall of terrain are also stunned. Hitting an enemy hunter spawns a lightning orb. If Joule picks it up, her cooldown on her dash is reset. Her ultimate launches her into the air, making her invulnerable. She can reactivate it to land on a target location, dealing damage to all enemies hit. If the target hit has any stacks of static, they're spread to all enemies within the ultimate's AoE, potentially setting her up for tons of dash resets. Every game needs a hook, and in Supervive, it's Kingpin. His passive grants him 50% bonus backstab damage. Enemy knocks and assists also grants him stacking max HP, but these stacks are lost on death. His left click is a short-range shotgun that gets incredibly inaccurate if he spams it too fast. His right click is a long-range hook that grabs the target and pulls it towards him. Enemies are briefly grounded after the hook duration ends, and this hook pierces through terrain. His mobility spell is a dash that has a separate cooldown and range depending on if it's used on the ground or while airborne. His E is a small AoE stun that also slams the target, meaning that if they are over the abyss, they get spiked even though they don't have their glider on. His ultimate fires out 6 short-range projectiles in a widespread. They do damage and apply anti-heal. Due to the nature of this ability and its passive, this deals a lot of damage up close from behind and almost no damage from the front and far away. Myth is a long-range archer that can walk through walls. Her passive grants her vision of low HP enemy hunters even if they're in fog of war, and she can scale double high ground walls with her jump. The longer Myth holds down her left click, the more damage and range it gets. There are 2 perfectly timed release windows, and if released here, she does even more damage and reduces the self-slow of shooting arrows. Her right click is another charged arrow that knocks enemies away. The longer she charges, the bigger the damage and knockback. Knocking an enemy into the wall stuns them and deals increased damage. Her E creates a wall of arrows that deals damage over time, applies anti-heal, and slows. Myth's mobility spell has 2 charges. First, she does a quick roll, and then she enters phase walk. For a short time, she can now walk through walls and objects. Allies and enemies can touch the mark she leaves behind to also enter phase walk, and taking damage ends this effect. When Myth ults, she gets to fire 3 left clicks that doesn't need charging. They have increased range, damage, and knocks enemies away. They also pierce destructible terrain and enemies. The final shot is extra powerful. Shiv is the DPS with the mandatory die button. Her left click is a medium range shot that deals damage and applies 1 stack of her passive. Her passive makes her left click deal more damage for each stack she has accumulated on the target. It also gives her a big heal on every knock and assist. Her mobility spell is a short dash that makes her next left click deal more damage. If the auto hits the target gains an extra passive stack, and the dash cooldown is completely reset. Her right click throws out a projectile that deals damage and grounds the first enemy hit. It then keeps traveling, and if a second target is hit, both targets are stunned. The target can also be a destructible object like trees. Her E throws out a blink dagger that sticks to any surface or enemy. Enemies hit by the dagger are slow. She can then reactivate the ability to travel to where the dagger landed. If she doesn't reactivate it, she will automatically travel to the dagger after a certain duration. Her ultimate is a bullet flurry that deals damage and maintains passive stacks on all enemies hit. It deals way more damage around the edge of the circle. Shiv can use all other abilities while channeling this ultimate, and she also gets 2 stacks of her mobility spell upon cast. Shrike is the sniper! Her left click is a long-range shot that deals less damage up close and more damage far away. It also applies her passive, Raptor's Mark. The passive stays on the target for 6 seconds, and if Shrike hits another left click or her ultimate on the marked target, it explodes for a bunch of extra damage. Her right click fires out a bomb that detonates after a short while, dealing damage, knocking enemies back, and stunning them. Her E fires out a hawk that doesn't deal damage but reveals the area and anti-heals any opponent it passes over. It can be reactivated to stop in its track and circle the area for a while. Her mobility spell fires a shot that knocks her backwards. The bullet deals damage, slows, and grounds the first enemy hit. If this ability knocks a hunter, its cooldown is reset, and if Shrike maxes out this ability, hitting an enemy is enough to get a reset. Her ultimate is a very long shot that deals a lot of damage and pierces through terrain. This shot also applies and detonates her passive. Jin runs fast and clones himself. Jin's passive gives him movement speed while out of sight of enemies, and in combat, dealing damage also grants him movement speed, stacking up to 3 times. Jin's left click is a 3-hit combo. The first is a stab, the second a slash, and the third a spit. The first attack can be charged up to deal more damage and shreds armor. His right click throws out a knife that deals damage and instantly teleports Jin behind the target. The cooldown of the knife is reset if he knocks an enemy. His mobility spell is a dash that has a separate cooldown and range if used on the ground or while airborne. He can also stay on the ground, click the mobility spell twice to utilize both dashes. His E deals damage and knocks enemies up into the air with him. He can then reactivate it to deal more damage based on the target's missing health. It also grounds the enemy and slams them, meaning they get spiked over the abyss even if they're not using their glider. His ultimate summons a clone that mimics Jin's spells. It can also be moved around while pressing R on target location, and Jin can hold down his R to swap places with it. He can only swap once during its duration. Elluna is a healing character that excels at supporting her team. Her passive makes her able to pick up allies who are downed, meaning that she can keep moving while resting. Her left click is a ranged projectile that deals extra damage and gives her mana back if she hits the same target consecutively. Her right click fires out a projectile that sticks to the first target it hits, and after a short delay it roots them and other enemies in its range. Her E is an AoE heal over time that lasts for a few seconds and ends with a bigger burst of healing. She can reactivate it to move it and attach it to allies. Her mobility spell is a dash that has a separate cooldown and range for use on the ground and while airborne. Dashing through allies refunds half of this ability's cooldown and reduces the cooldown of her AoE heal. Her ultimate channels on an ally for 5 seconds and provides a bit of healing over time. If the ally is down during this duration, they are immediately resurrected and teleported to Elluna. Oath is I don't know what he is, but he has a shield. His left click throws out his hammer to target location, dealing damage to all enemies it passes through. Clicking again brings the hammer back, dealing damage again. While the hammer is on the ground, it grants vision. He can hold down his left click to turn it into a charged melee attack that knocks enemies back. His right click is a shield that blocks all damage but drains his orange energy bar. It slowly regenerates while the shield is not being used, but if it breaks, the shield cannot be used for a while. His mobility spell is a dash that deals damage and knocks enemies back. If this is used when his shield is out, it instead turns into a shield bag bash. That also knocks enemies back. The shield bash has a separate cooldown. His passive makes it so that his shield bash and his charged left click applies a stun if the enemy is knocked into a wall or another enemy. His E is a short heal over time with a burst at the end. This heal appears wherever the hammer is when cast. His ultimate is a big AoE stun and slow that deals damage to all enemies hit. This ability is blocked by walls. Zeph is a healer that provides extra mobility to the team. His passive applies a mark to the enemy when Zeph hits his left click, and when he hits marked enemies with his abilities, good stuff happens. His left click is a small projectile that deals damage. It can be charged to deal more damage, have further range, and pierce through enemies. Hitting enemies gives him mana back, and if the enemy has his passive on, he will deal more damage and reduce the cooldown of his heal by 1 second. His right click is a targeted heal that has several stacks. It instantly heals the target ally and allies it passes through. His E is a small AoE that detonates after a while, dealing damage and pulling enemies towards its center. If several enemies are pulled in and hit each other, they're also stunned. If the target has his passive on, hitting this ability also gives him 1 full charge back on his heal. His ultimate is a large, wide blast that deals damage and knocks back all enemies hit. If the target has his passive on, it deals double damage. This ability also heals every ally it hits, and any knocked ally hit will begin resurrecting. Holding down his mobility spell creates a cyclone that sends Zeph and any nearby allies away. Tap this ability, and it's a small dash that refunds most of its cooldown. Celeste is a frost lady that controls the battlefield. Her passive makes her damaging abilities apply chill for 4 seconds. If a chilled enemy dies, they shatter, dealing damage around them in a small AoE. Holding down her left click fires out a spree of small ice darts, followed up by 3 stronger darts. The small ice darts are slightly homing, and hitting 8 darts on the same target procs the passive, dealing damage in a small AoE around. Her right click fires out a projectile that explodes, creating a small area that slows enemies in. After a short while, it detonates again, dealing more damage. This spell has 2 charges. Her E summons a wall that pushes enemies away and blocks incoming projectiles. Holding down her mobility spell makes Celeste skate away, covering a great distance. If she releases this ability early, the cooldown is significantly reduced. Her left click deals double the damage if fired out while skating. Her ultimate creates a huge zone that slows all enemies and makes Celeste invulnerable. After a while, the zone explodes, dealing damage and stunning all enemies hit. Celeste can end this ability early at the risk of not getting the explosion and the stun. Line of sight blocks this ability. Hudson is a big tanky man with a minigun. His passive gives him a chunky heal and armor repair when knocking an enemy hunter. And after not taking damage for 4 seconds, Hudson starts to slowly regenerate his armor. Finally, Hudson takes 25% increased damage from the back. His left click fires rapidly, dealing damage with each bullet. Holding down right click fills his orange bar. When filled up, his left click gains increased fire rate at the cost of his own movement speed and turn speed. His bullets also heal him while this is activated. His mobility spell has 2 charges. Pressing and holding it sends him flying with some maneuverability. Colliding with an enemy deals damage and knocks them away. His E shoots out some barbed wire that slows and grounds enemies walking through it. Enemies standing still or sneaking through the wire take no damage. Enemies flying into the wire take extra damage based on their velocity. Hudson's ultimate fires out a hook that connects to the enemy for 4 seconds. They are then slowed and anti-healed. If they ever fall below 30% health, the hook will pull them in and execute them. Killing enemies with this creates a pickup version of his passive that allies can use to restore health and armor. Void is a creepy dude that swaps people around. His left click fires out a projectile that pierces terrain. It deals more damage, has more range, and slows if he waits a little bit in between each shot. His right click fires out a medium range projectile that deals damage and stuns the first enemy hit. His E creates an area that slowly expands. If you reactivate it before it runs out, it deals a burst of damage and grounds enemies hit. If Void maxes out this ability, the AoE also deals damage over time. His ultimate creates a black hole that stuns enemies and pulls them towards its center for its duration. His mobility spell fires out a projectile that he then teleports to after a short duration. Anything in the area of this spell then swaps places with Void. Now, onto how the passive works. Dealing damage fills up this purple bar. When maxed out, Void becomes empowered. His teleport now swaps places much faster. His E grows larger and more quickly, and his ultimate covers a much bigger area. Finally, Void floats, meaning he makes no noise and is unaffected by slowing terrain like water. So there you have it. Those are all the current hunters and what they do. If you found this video helpful, feel free to leave a like, subscribe for more Supervive content, and if you're watching this close to its upload, I'm live right now playing Supervive with my friends on Twitch. Feel free to drop by and say hi. I'd love to have you in the chat. Alright, this has been Spuzie, and I'm out.
Do it!